Churchill, Manitoba, located on the edge of the Arctic, just west of the Hudson Bay area, and home to one of the largest remaining polar bear habitats in the world. It is one of Canada's more popular tourist sites because of the high chances of polar bear sightings. This is where we will be delving into today. The polar bear, also known as the Ursus maritimus, evolved to blend into the Arctic environment. Their white fur provides camouflage for hunting on the ice and in the snow to obtain their prey of choice, the ice seals, desirable for their high fat content. Ideally, there would be more than 6 months of ice so that the fat they stored is enough for their survival during the few summer months when they are unable to hunt when the ice melts. The major issue facing them now is not only the ice melting earlier every year, but also the decreasing population of seals because of the longer summers. These drastic changes to what the polar bear needs has had ripple effects into what their future will look like. Each summer, the ice melts sooner, causes more frequent failures in pregnant mothers, predicted to be up to a 55% failure rate within 20 years. What's even more prevalent, though, is that some studies have predicted the first ice-free summer to be as soon as 2016, and it only goes downhill from there. The culprit? Climate change. Our hope is that through the information presented today, you come to a greater awareness of the rapid changes happening in the Hudson Bay area and help to #save the polar bears.
The main problem in the Hudson Bay area is the disruption of the ecosystem. Polar bears usually come onto land for 4 months in the summertime from July to October. Over the years, this time has increased about 3 to 4 weeks, which may not seem like a lot, but equates to about 6 seals or a couple hundred pounds. Because of the decreases in the hunting period, there are more skinny bears. The male adults are not as affected because they are great hunters, but the females with cubs and subadults are. Females must support 2 or 3 cubs, which gives them less time to hunt for themselves, decreasing their weight. With the falling weight of the females, the species are unable to reproduce, and there are more twins and single cubs being born rather than triplets. The Hudson Bay used to be a very reproductive area because there is shallow water and the seals love shallow water. But in the last 20 years, the population of the polar bears have dropped from 1,200 to 800 in the area. The melting of the ice has caused a major disruption of the ecosystem. Killer whales are now finding themselves entering into this area because of the open water. This causes new competition for the polar bear since the whales mostly feed on seals. The seals in this area, which include ring seals, harbor seals, and bearded seals, are mostly ice obligate, or they need ice in order to survive. Therefore, the seals are unable to reproduce and are getting eaten by killer whales, leaving the polar bears with less food to eat during the hunting season. Some scientists believe that the polar bears will be able to adapt to a decrease in the sea ice, but the polar bear's lifespan is so long, it is less likely evolution would be a possibility. Polar bears are able to eat goose eggs, berries, and some plants on land. The polar bears, though, are not able to process these foods the same way grizzly bears are, and can't gain the necessary calories. Also, if a whale were to wash up on the beach in the Hudson Bay area, the grizzly bear would most likely fight and win against a polar bear for the food. Due to the greenhouse effect, if we do not get our emissions under control, there will be no sea ice left for the polar bears. The enhanced greenhouse effect is when the short-wave ultraviolet radiation from the sun is absorbed by the Earth's atmosphere, and some of the radiation is reflected back into space as long-wave infrared radiation. The greenhouse gases in the atmosphere absorbs the infrared radiation and reflects it back toward the Earth, causing the temperature of the Earth to rise as it is converted into heat. This effect is causing the temperature of the ocean to rise and the sea ice to melt. It is estimated that there will be no sea ice left in the Hudson Bay region in the next 100 years. There will still be some located in the north part of the Arctic, but the sea ice will be smaller and in deeper waters, making it harder for the polar bears to find food. If we get our carbon emissions under control, we will be able to get the sea ice back in the Hudson Bay area. Because sea ice responds quickly to carbon emissions, it will only take a few years for it to return.
Normally, the greenhouse effect would be considered a positive phenomenon because heat getting trapped in the atmosphere allows for moderate temperatures. Without the greenhouse effect, temperatures would drastically differ from day to night, which would be harmful for our planet's organisms since they wouldn't be able to constantly cope with such extremities. In order for the greenhouse effect to be beneficial, there must always be a balance between the amount of emissions entering and leaving the atmosphere. However, ever since the Industrial Revolution, beginning in the 1800s, more greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide, have been increasing in number in the atmosphere. This is due to the emergence of factories and new industrial technology, because in order to utilize fuels such as oil, combustion, which is the burning of fossil fuels, must occur. While this provides necessary resources that we use in our everyday lives, this also leads to an increase of carbon dioxide in the environment. Therefore, more factories or fossil-burning machinery, such as cars, means that more greenhouse emissions are being released into the environment. This can be seen in Canada, where 25% of greenhouse gas emissions comes just from transportation. More trapped greenhouse emissions upsets the delicate balance in the atmosphere and leads to more heat being trapped in the atmosphere. This starts to negatively affect the Earth and its inhabitants, as we can see with the polar bears. In a disturbing case of the domino effect, the bountiful emissions cause temperatures to rise, the Arctic's ice to melt, and the polar bears to disappear. Polar bears have vainly tried to continue their existence, but with the shrinking ice and polar ice caps, they are forced to hibernate for longer periods of time and swim longer distances in order to reach ice. Scientists have documented polar bears having to swim as far as 60 miles to find ice, which has led to an increased number of polar bears drowning at sea. While polar bears have evolved to swim, they cannot swim forever, and they cannot survive without the ice. This has been supported by a 2007 U.S. Geological Survey, which predicts that if nothing is done to limit the emissions, 2/3 of the polar bear population could disappear by 2050. The tragedy doesn't end there, however. The extinction of polar bears would horribly affect other species in the Arctic ecosystem, since the polar bears are on the top of the food chain. Their end could result in the entire ecosystem collapsing in on itself, since many animals are connected to the polar bear. Thankfully, more and more people are beginning to realize the danger that surrounds the polar bears, and efforts by various governments, organizations, and zoos have been undertaken in order to save the species. For example, a large amount of scientists, politicians, and zoo officials have proposed to increase the number of captive polar bears in zoos so that even if the population continues to decrease, there will still be some polar bears remaining. This plan has been put in effect in places like Canada, where the Manitoba Park Zoo has created an international polar bear conservation center to help transition polar bear cubs into captivity. However, getting polar bears into captivity could prove to be difficult, since there are various laws limiting the importation of polar bears, such as the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Other habitats and wildlife centers have been established as well in an effort to save the polar bears, such as by the Coca-Cola Company. Yet even those that advocate for conservation centers agree that the most effective way to save the polar bears would be to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Their hope is that when people see the polar bears at the zoo, for example, they will become more aware of the climate change issue and want to help decrease the emissions. Unfortunately, while Canada wants the polar bear species to survive, their policy is more concerned with their sovereignty over the Arctic and utilizing the Arctic for economic development rather than preserving it. Furthermore, while the Canadian government has been a part of several agreements, such as the famous Agreement of the Conservation of Polar Bears, signed by Canada, Norway, Greenland, Russia, and the USA in 1973, these efforts have not been enough. For example, the 1973 document only signifies that those countries were willing to collaborate and cooperate in order to help the polar bears, but it doesn't mention what those actions would be undertaken. There have been a few actions the Canadian government has taken, however, to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The government has established a goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from 2005 levels by 17% by 2020. However, if any change is to come, then more drastic measures must be taken. It is our hope that Canada and other countries will take even further actions and significantly cut back on their gas emissions, not only for the sake of the polar bears, but for the sake of our planet and home, Earth. Okay, that was 4 minutes. That's not too bad.